Hey everyone, happy Halloween! I just read the Necronomicon, the best weird tales of H.P. Lovecraft, and the stories here are really too many and varied for me to do justice in a single overarching review, so I'm going to go in and review every single one of them. Consider this my Halloween treat to you. Even if it's not actually Halloween when you watch this, it's always Halloween somewhere. That makes sense. I understand how time works. Reviews will be in the same order they're presented in the book. A full ranking will be at the end of the video. Let's get to it. First up is Night-Gaunts, and it was okay. I don't think I've ever individually reviewed something shorter than the script of its own review, but here we are. It's a short poem about a group of strange faceless monsters called Night-Gaunts. The prose: the titular Night-Gaunts are a creepy idea. I liked the mystery of how they come on the north wind swell. The strange places they carry people away to sound like fun, and this is really stretching it, I know, but the accompanying illustration really adds to the atmosphere. The cons? Lovecraft is just not a very good poet. There's not much meat to this bit of writing, it is pretty one note, and the twist that the Night-Gaunts have no face is pretty much spoiled by the accompanying illustration, good though it is. It's a fine appetizer, but it's definitely not anything worth writing home about, and I'm giving Night-Gaunts a C. Next is Dagon, and it was pretty good. Now this is a Lovecraftian tale. It's a short story about a sailor recounting the tale of when he found himself stranded within a strange expanse of land while lost at sea during World War I. The prose? Lovecraft is much better at writing prose than he is with poetry. The language here was a bit purple, but it was really well written. I liked how the story left it ambiguous as to whether the narrator truly fell into some strange otherworldly place, or if the whole experience was a hallucination. And the pillar covered in ancient bas-reliefs was really creepy. The way it's just there in the middle of an otherwise empty void is really effective. The cons? The story doesn't really build to anything. The narrator just goes mad from his encounter with Dagon, and that's about it. The strange place the narrator ends up isn't that horrifying on its own, beyond the inherent strangeness of it suddenly being there instead of the Pacific Ocean. And the setup of how the narrator was a sailor who found himself lost at sea because his boat was attacked by Germans and he only just escaped is glossed over in about a paragraph, which is a shame because it's a solid way to get him into position to encounter the horrific things that he does. I struggled to find things I didn't like about this story. I think it's a strong short, and even better, it lacks a lot of Lovecraft's overt racism, so it's much easier to recommend to a reader curious about giving his works a go. And I'm giving Dagon an A. Third off the rank is The Statement of Randolph Carter, and it was okay. I did love how, because of the time period this story was written in, it has to specify that the lantern Randolph uses is electric. It's a short story about a young man, the titular Carter, giving a statement to the police regarding the disappearance of his close friend Warren after the two attempt to open a passageway between our world and the underworld. The prose? Randolph's narration, flowery though it is, was very nice. The mystery of what exactly Warren found at the bottom of the stairs beneath the ancient graveyard is intriguing, and Warren was a really interesting character with his collection of strange books and obsession with the occult. I wish there had been more of him. The cons? The dialogue here is pretty ridiculous. Even giving it some slack for the antiquated linguistics, it still came off as unrealistic. Lovecraft's refusal to describe what happens to Warren was pretty grating, especially when he's constantly screaming, "Oh, if only you could see it, but I dare not describe it lest you be burdened with the same terror. It's too horrifying for words, if only you could know how horrifying it is, oh!" And the final line just came off as silly to me. It felt like a "then who was phone" moment from a bad creepypasta, rather than a moment of terror. I know it's a classic, but I didn't get much out of it personally. But hey, at least it's not racist, and I'm giving The Statement of Randolph Carter a B. Next. Fourth is The Doom That Came to Sarnath, and it was really fun. I do love a good cautionary tale. It's a short story about a city that is punished by the gods for their terrible crimes against some innocent fish people. Honestly, deserved. The prose? This story honestly felt like something out of ancient myth. It captured the feeling well, and Lovecraft's style of writing complemented it very nicely. I loved the descriptions of Sarnath's opulence. It makes the city's titular doom all the more of a contrast, and the massacre that brings the titular doom to Sarnath is tragic in both concept and description. The cons? The way the High Priest writes "Doom" in the temple is pretty silly. The made-up fantasy names are pretty silly too, and as is often the case, Lovecraft really shies away from describing the horrible things that happen to Sarnath at the end, leaving the story as kind of an anticlimax. I know Lovecraft was a horribly xenophobic man, but this story honestly comes across as an indictment of racial discrimination. I love the ancient mythic feel of this short. I'd easily recommend it to you if you haven't given it a read already, and I'm giving The Doom That Came to Sarnath an A. Next is The Cats Cats of Ulthar, and you can really tell Lovecraft was a cat person. No wonder he was so obsessed with Egypt. It's a short story about a town called Ulthar that is home to a couple who murder cats, and the consequences of their own actions. The prose? I enjoyed the grim dark fairy tale feel of this story. I could imagine parents telling their kids this before bed to get them not to hurt stray cats around town. I liked the small cast of townsfolk, short though their roles are. They added a nice garnish of character to the story, and the ending, while obvious, was very satisfying. The cons? It's very short. There's not much meat to sink your teeth into here. Lovecraft's racism is starting to shine through in some of the language of this story, and the made-up names are pretty silly, but that's just a nitpick, honestly. This is a fun story. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but I certainly wouldn't not recommend it, and I'm giving the Cats of Ulthar a B. Sixth, we've got the Nameless City, and it was fantastic. This is exactly my kind of horror story. It's a short story about a man who stumbles across the ruins of a mysterious ancient city in the middle of the desert. The prose? I love the descriptions of the city. I don't know how, but Lovecraft managed to achieve architectural uncanny valley, even with his refusal to describe the stranger aspects of it in detail. The narrator's journey through and then under the city was really well paced. I loved how at one point it ceased to be an exploration of some old ruins and became a descent into something otherworldly. And the subtlety of the horror, like the hallway of monster coffins the narrator stumbles across, was really creepy. I really enjoyed it. The cons? Like many of Lovecraft's stories, it ends very abruptly. Lovecraft's racism is definitely a little more obvious here in the language he uses to describe Abdul al-Hazrad, and the monster itself just came across as silly rather than frightening when it finally appeared. Maybe it would have been better not to describe this one. Even so, I really enjoyed this story. It's exactly what I want in a horror short, and I'd easily give it a recommend. And I'm giving The Nameless City an A. Following that is Herbert West, Reanimator, and it was pretty good. Who looked at this story and thought, you know what? I could make a great comedy movie out of this. It's a story about a young brain genius obsessed with curing death and the grisly results of his horrific experiments over the years. That kind of sounds familiar. The prose? The way the story dances around openly describing the experiments and their results is really effective. Not only does it leave the best horror to the imagination, but when the story does finally let loose at the end, it serves as fantastic build-up. I really enjoyed the escalation of conflict here, how West starts out wanting to cure death and uses animals in his tests, but eventually degrades into a mad scientist just bringing people back to life just to see if he can in the trenches of Flanders during World War I. And I liked the friendship between West and the story's narrator. It was nice in a macabre sort of way. The cons? This story was originally serialized over several weeks, and the recaps at the start of every chapter are really tedious, especially in how repetitive they are. Lovecraft's racism is on full display here, and it really took me out of the story. And like many of Lovecraft's stories, it has a very abrupt ending for how much build-up there was. This was a good story. Aside from the racism, I really enjoyed it. It's more or less a gorier Frankenstein, so if that sounds like your thing, I'd suggest you give it a read. Just be aware of Lovecraft's xenophobia going into it because it sneaks up on you in this one, and I'm giving Herbert West Reanimator a B. Eighth in line is the music of Erich Zann, and it was good. What's this? A Lovecraft story set beyond the shores of New England? I don't believe it. It's a short story about a man who comes to know one of his fellow tenants, the titular Zann, through the music he plays in his apartment each night. The prose? I loved the mystery of Zann's character, how the story makes it clear he's been through some sort of nightmare, but we only ever get glimpses of it as readers. This story really favours Lovecraft's usual vagueness, and the written medium as a whole. No matter what any composer wrote for a film or TV adaptation, the music would always fall short compared to the reader's imagination. And I liked the French setting. It was a nice change of pace from Lovecraft's usual haunts of New England and ruined wastelands. The cons? When Lovecraft does go out of his way to describe Zann's music, it's pretty anemic compared to the images he's trying to conjure and to his usual descriptive prose. The friendship between the narrator and Zann felt pretty undercooked. It's only a short story, so I wasn't expecting a nuanced arc or anything, but they don't even really like each other, and yet Zann decides to reveal all of his secrets to the narrator in a letter, though he never actually reads it. And like a lot of these stories, it has a very abrupt ending. This is a fine story. Musical horror is something I don't think gets enough love, and there's no racism to drag things down either. I'd easily recommend it if you haven't given it a read already, and I'm giving the music of Erich Zann a B. Ninth is The Lurking Fear, and I loved this story. Reading it during a thunderstorm was perhaps not the wisest choice, but it definitely added to the atmosphere. It's a story about a man who goes to investigate a series of strange murders perpetrated during thunderstorms in a remote part of New England. The prose? I loved the journey of the protagonist in this story, how he starts as merely initially a curious investigator and slowly unravels into a man obsessed with solving the mystery. With the emphasis on thunderstorms and Lovecraft's style of prose, there was a real feeling of gothic horror to this story, and I really enjoyed it. And I really loved the solution to the mystery, twist and all. It's a bit silly, but it worked for me. The cons. The way Lovecraft describes the locals comes off as, if not racist, then definitely problematic. It's hard to get invested when people die, since Lovecraft doesn't put much emphasis on fleshing out characters other than the narrator and Jan Martens, who is long dead by the start of the story anyway. And the story definitely stretches the suspension of disbelief in some ways, but whatever, it's a nitpick. It was a struggle to find things I didn't like about this story. I really enjoyed it. I definitely recommend it if you're looking for a scary story to read while there's a thunderstorm raging outside, especially since it's not that overt in its racism like some of Lovecraft's other works, and I'm giving The Lurking Fear an S. Next is The Hound, and it was okay. Certainly not one of his best. It's a story about a pair of friends who take a strange talisman from a grave in the Netherlands and a curse that follows them home to New England as a result. The prose. I liked the background of the two friends being obsessed with the occult and all the little references to other parts of the Cthulhu mythos. It really added to the mood. The horror of The Hound was actually pretty effective. I got a few chills here and there. And for once the twist ending stuck the landing, which was great. The cons? In many ways this story is just the statement of Randolph Carter again. It's quite bare bones in terms of character, it could have used a bit of fleshing out, and good as the twist ending is, the story doesn't really resolve, it just sort of stops. It's fine, I enjoyed it. I'd recommend it if you've got 5 minutes before bed and want something to read, and I'm giving The Hound a B. Number 11 is The Rats in the Walls, and that poor cat. Oh, and the story was fine, though I've always felt it was a bit overrated. It's a short story about an American businessman who travels to England to reclaim his recently restored ancestral home of Exham Priory, believed by the locals to be cursed. The prose. I really enjoyed the English setting. It doesn't just set the story apart from a lot of Lovecraft's other shorts, which seem to swing between New England and the Middle East, but it also gives the tale a sense of ancient dread that his works set in the United States just can't match. I also really loved the build-up of this one, starting with the story of how the narrator's ancestor killed his family and fled the property to start a new life in Virginia, then going through the narrator's experiences of living in the restored castle, and finally ending with what he discovers underneath it. It was really well done, and I know it's probably meant to be taken as something that actually happened, but the way this story is written leaves it a little ambiguous as to whether the events described actually occurred, or if they're just a result of the narrator losing his mind, which I really liked. The cons. The racism, do you even have to ask? There isn't much dialogue in this story, but what little there is was so terrible it took me right out of the tale. It's definitely not one of his strengths. And for how good the build-up is across the story and how descriptive Lovecraft actually is on the horrors this time around, I don't think the payoff is that great. It's always stuck me as feeling kind of lackluster. It's not bad, it's a classic of horror, and it's pretty close to the centre of the meme regarding Lovecraft's racism, but I don't know. I think the hype kind of ruined this one for me. Give it a read if you're a fan of the genre and haven't already, but it won't change your mind about Lovecraft if you're not already interested in his work, and I'm giving The Rats in the Walls a B. Now we're up to Under the Pyramid, and it was very, very long. It's bonkers to think that this was ghost-written for Harry Houdini, of all people. It's a short story about Harry Houdini's holiday to Egypt between touring his magic show, and the strange subterranean world he ends up stumbling into beneath, as the title suggests, the pyramids. The prose. The prose, as usual, is really good. It's definitely wordy, but it fits the mood of the time and the tone of the story very well. I'm not that interested in ancient Egypt. I've always found the city-states of Mesopotamia much more interesting myself, but Lovecraft does a good job of building up a sense of timeless dread using classic Egyptian ideas, like the pyramids and the Sphinx. It was very atmospheric, and the climactic scene beneath the pyramids, while a little too long for my liking, was very well written. The cons. I know very little about Harry Houdini, but it didn't feel like Lovecraft made any attempt to change up his style to fit the man's manner of speaking or prose. The story just still feels like classic Lovecraft. It is way too long for what it is. Right when you think the story is winding down and the horror has already passed, suddenly it drags on for another 10 pages, and it's just too much. Every time I go through this collection, I always burn out at this story, and this was no exception. And this story definitely leans hard into Orientalist stereotypes regarding Egypt, though it's certainly not nearly as racist as some of Lovecraft's other stories. It's not bad, but it's way too long as far as I'm concerned. It's got some good ideas, but it's still just very strange to think this was written from the perspective of Harry Houdini, and I'm giving Under the Pyramids a low B. Next we've got The Unnameable, and it was pretty average to be honest. Is this really one of his best weird tales? I've never heard it talked about anywhere else. It's a short story about Randolph Carter telling a spooky story to his skeptic friend about an old abandoned house who laughs it off, and I'm not saying this is based on real events from Lovecraft's life, but it does feel an awful lot like a revenge fic. The pros. I liked the friendship between Randolph Carter and Joel Manton. It felt genuine in a way nothing else in this story really did, especially the bickering about unshared interests. I really liked the idea of windows retaining glimpses of things from the past. It's the best concept used in the story, and it deserved a better tale, honestly. And I just love how petty this story feels. Like Lovecraft went, "I'll show you for thinking my spiritualism is ridiculous." It's such a writer thing to do, it's great. The cons? The dialogue feels so forced. There's nothing natural about it. There's very little meat to this story. There's not much horror. There's not much dread. Like I said, it just feels like something that really happened to Lovecraft that he felt bitter about and decided to write into a story. And on that note, it feels pretty rough, like it's a first draft that didn't get the attention it needed. Not that it really deserved it in my opinion. There's not much to this story, to be completely honest. It's not terrible, but it's definitely not one of Lovecraft's better tales. You can probably skip it if it's not in a collection you happen to pick up, and I'm giving The Unnameable a C. Then there's In the Vault. And Lovecraft was really scraping the bottom of the barrel with this one. This story gives a whole new meaning to the term ankle biter. It's a short story about an undertaker called George Birch who finds himself trapped in a vault after a moment of misadventure, and what it costs him to escape. The pros? It's well written. Lovecraft knows how to spin a good yarn, even if the yarn is a bit crap. George Birch is an interesting protagonist. The story gives a good sense of the kind of person he is, despite its short length. What a cheapskate. And the story doesn't outstay its welcome. It lasts just long enough to say what it wants to say, and then ends, which I'm very glad for. The cons? This story just isn't particularly scary. The horror aspects aren't particularly interesting, the twist ending is obvious, it's just meh. Despite its short length, it does still drag a bit. There's just not enough of an idea here to really warrant how much of it there is. You can really tell Lovecraft was being paid by the word. And there's no hook, there's nothing to grab the reader, especially these days when the genre has moved past this sort of middle-of-the-road pulpy gothic stuff. It's definitely not one of Lovecraft's better stories, but hey, at least it's not too racist, though just barely clearing the bar of human decency does not a good story make. Give it a read if it's in a collection, but on its own it's not worth it in my opinion, and I'm giving In the Vault a D. Sorry. At 15, we've got The Outsider, and yeah, that was really good. It's a shame Lovecraft is such a problematic person because man, his writing hits home sometimes. It's a short story about someone who lives alone in an old abandoned castle who goes out into the world to cure his crushing loneliness, only to find everyone he encounters repulsed by a monster that seems to be following him everywhere he goes. The pros? The prose and technical construction of this story is fantastic. It's definitely old-fashioned, but it hits every beat perfectly. The narrator is a fascinating character. We don't learn much about him, but his sense of social isolation just screams off the page in everything he does. It was great, and the twist ending is just such a stab through the heart. It is tragic, all the more so for how autobiographical and relatable it feels. The cons? This is one of those stories that is so widely known and so well regarded that there's no way it can possibly live up to the hype. It's still good, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. Not much actually happens in this story. It's all very introspective, which is fine, but it's not usually my kind of thing. And while I do really like the story overall, it doesn't do much to grab the reader in its first couple of paragraphs, or at least it didn't for me. It's a good story overall. It's a very relatable tale, even today, but it definitely doesn't live up to its hype. At least it didn't for me. That said, I'd still easily recommend it to fans of Lovecraft and horror in general, and I'm giving The Outsider an A. Next is The Colour Out of Space, and it was great. It's rare that a story is capable of getting under my skin, but this one did it. It's a story about the construction of a reservoir on an area of land called the Blasted Hill, where several decades earlier there fell a rock containing something alien and unknowable. The pros? I really enjoyed the pacing of this one. Not just how it starts off in the present with an inspection of the Blasted Hill for the proposed reservoir before jumping back to explain what happened to the Gardner farm, but the slow escalation of the horror aspects across the entire story. How the meteor starts off as just a little weird, a little unusual that it remains hot after falling out of the sky, but then it starts emitting colours that don't exist and poisoning the soil. It was really effective and really creepy. The horror aspects in and of themselves were fantastic. They don't just touch on the old fears of things that are unknown and unknowable, fears of things that seem impossible, but the much more recent fear of environmental devastation and what effect that might have on us who have to live with it. The narrator's lines about how the water in the reservoir is technically safe, but he will never drink from it, were haunting. And I love the sense of helplessness that permeates the story. All these horrible things happen, and there's nothing the characters can do but ride it out. They are completely powerless against it. The cons, the dialogue, goodness me, the dialogue, it's awful. It feels so artificial it took me completely out of the story. This one falls victim to Lovecraft's refusal to specifically describe some of the horrors encountered by the protagonists. That vagueness really works for a lot of it, but there's no moment of payoff at the end that really satisfies the atmosphere built up across the rest of the tale. And great as this story is, it doesn't preclude it from having a lot of Lovecraft's usual foibles that I've already spent a lot of time bemoaning in this video, but that's just par for the course with these things. I love this story, it's such a classic. If you're a fan of cosmic horror and haven't already given it a read, you owe it to yourself to check it out, and I'm giving The Colour Out of Space an S. Following that is Horror at Red Hook, and wow, that was even more racist than usual, far out. It didn't even have the decency to be a good horror story either. It's a short story about Detective Thomas Malone's investigation into mysterious Red Hook resident Robert Sidham. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, sorry. The prose? I suppose it's interesting to read a Lovecraft story that is mostly separate from his mythos. The use of a more stereotypical cult is an interesting change of pace, and a different kind of horror, and if the tale weren't so racist and rambling, it would probably work a lot better. It certainly paints a vivid, if extremely xenophobic picture of Red Hook. You can really tell Lovecraft knew the area, in his own skewed way. And it's not a bad idea for a mystery story taken out of context. The cons? Horribly, horribly racist, goodness me. The prose for this one was pretty rough, it drags in a lot of places, it felt very first draft. And in a lot of ways this just felt like Under the Pyramids again, right down to featuring Nitocris as one of the horrors lurking deep underground. The idea is fine in concept, but horribly executed. Even Lovecraft apparently didn't like this one, so I think fans can probably give it a skip, and I'm giving Horror at Red Hook an F. Then we've got Pickman's model, and it was alright. Go to the Wikipedia page for this story right now, and look up Lovecraft's doodle of what he imagined Pickman's model to be. You can thank me later if you don't die of laughter first. It's a story about an eccentric painter by the name of Pickman, known for his grotesque and lifelike works involving monstrous ghouls. The prose? I like how this story was presented like a monologue where the narrator is telling a story to the reader as if part of a larger conversation. It was something a little different for Lovecraft and gave the story something of a unique quality to it. The idea of an artist painting horrific images from real-life monsters is really creepy, especially with its references to actual real horrific paintings like Saturn consuming his children. And the story's use of monsters coming up from the underground is really creepy too, even if the monsters themselves aren't that scary these days. The cons? Speaking of which, this may have been shocking for the 1920s, but in the 2020s this story is pretty tame. There's nothing really that scary about it anymore. Oh, what's this? Racism? In an H.P. Lovecraft story? Surely you jest. And I would have liked to have got more of a sense of who Pickman is as a character, but whatever, it's a nitpick. It's not bad, but like a certain other story about paintings with supernatural origins by Oscar Wilde, it's just too tame to really achieve its potential for horror anymore. That said, it's still worth a read in my opinion if you're a fan of horror, just don't go into it expecting a sleepless night afterward, and I'm giving Pickman's model a B. After that we've got the Call of Cthulhu, and I've got to be honest, it was just alright. The ideas are fantastic, but they're not put together very well. It's a short story about one man's investigation into a mysterious international cult who worship a being called Cthulhu, and the encounters various people have had with both the creature and its followers all over the world. The prose? The ideas taken out of context are amazing. It's no wonder they've had such an impact on the horror genre. Not only the idea of ancient beings worshipped by secret cults, but the hidden island chanced upon at sea that sinks beneath the waves never to return. It is all cosmic horror at its best. I loved the huge scope and scale of this story. It's not just confined to New England. It takes place all across the United States, Norway, and even reaches my own homeland, Australia. And of the 3 vignettes that comprise this story, the third set on the alert was by far my favourite, if only because it actually gives the reader a satisfying payoff in terms of describing the horrible monstrosity that is Cthulhu. The cons. Howard, could you please not be racist for one story? I really did not enjoy the way this story is told for the most part. I don't mind that it's divided into 3 vignettes regarding the Cthulhu cult, but they're all written in a very tell-don't-show way, where the narrator is just recounting things that happen to characters who don't appear, and it just kills the short for me. And if I had to pick a least favourite of the 3 vignettes, it would probably be the first one. It's just so similar to Lovecraft's other works in a way that the other 2 really aren't. You can't really deny the impact this story has had on horror as a genre, but going back to it now in 2020, it's just fine. If you're a fan of the genre, it's definitely worth a read if you haven't checked it out already, but if you don't like Lovecraft's work, this isn't going to change your mind, and I'm giving the Call of Cthulhu a B. Next there's Cool Air, and it was pretty chilling. Everyone always mentions how Batman stole Arkham Asylum from H.P. Lovecraft, but nobody ever realizes they stole Mr. Freeze too. It's a short story about a man who befriends the doctor living in the apartment above his own, who has a strange illness that requires him to stay at freezing cold temperatures at all times. The pros. I quite enjoyed the setup for this one, with the narrator discovering ammonia dripping through his ceiling from the apartment above, and then going on to befriend the tenant. It draws you into the situation really effectively, even if you know right away something horrible is going to come of it as a result. This story is definitely a little racist, which I'll get into in the cons, but Dr. Munoz is probably the closest thing to a normal minority character Lovecraft has ever written, at least so far. So, you know, progress. And the chaos that leads up to the final line was really good. Lovecraft's penchant for being vague really works in this story's favour, given how obvious the twist is by that point. The cons. You know that meme where it's hello Yoshi from Super Mario, hello Chocobo from Final Fantasy, and then they both become fat versions of themselves? Well, in this story it's hello Ian Fleming, writer of James Bond, hello H.P. Lovecraft, writer of the Cthulhu mythos, and then it's just their racist phonetic accents. I don't know, maybe I'll make it for the video and you can be looking at it as I say this. The story basically has the same structure and plotting of the music of Erich Zann, and it just felt a little repetitive in that regard. And I don't know why, but the narrator having a heart attack and then climbing up a flight of stairs to get help just ruined the suspension of disbelief for me. Which is very odd, I know, given what else happens in this story. But whatever, I guess it's a nitpick. I enjoyed this one. It's simple, it's effective, it's still pretty racist, but if you can get past that, I think it's pretty good, and I'd recommend it if you're a fan of more subdued tales of horror. And I'm giving Cool Air a crisp A. Then there's The Shunned House, and it was okay. Crazy to think this story is based on a real house that actually exists. It's a novelette about a house located in, where else, Providence, Rhode Island, and the long history of misfortune that befalls everyone who comes to call it home. The pros? Lovecraft knew his stuff about Providence. The story does a really good job of describing the house's part in the city's history, right down to the street it's located on. The level of detail adds a layer of realism to what is otherwise a supernatural horror tale. Even the source of the house's haunting was a real person, apparently. I really enjoyed the last couple of chapters where the narrator and his uncle go ghost hunting, for lack of a better term, in the mouldy basement of the titular house. It's nice to have a couple of Lovecraft protagonists who understand that the only way to deal with these monstrous things are flamethrowers and a frankly absurd amount of acid. And given Lovecraft is an author known for his tragic endings where people either end up dead or insane, it was nice to read a story that wasn't so bleak by the final page. The cons? This story covers a couple of centuries worth of hauntings in the titular house, and it was just too much in my opinion. There was definitely some fat to trim. After all the build-up across the story, there's no real payoff. There is a moment that comes close in the penultimate chapter, but it wasn't quite enough, and an elbow, even an abnormally large one, just isn't that scary. And I think it might have helped to make it clear the story has a first-person narrator, because it goes on for a little while talking about the history of the house before revealing the lead character, and it just felt a little jarring to me. Whatever, it's a nitpick. It's good, but for a short story it is very long, and most of it is just about the history of the house, though I can't really state enough how amazing the climax is. I'd recommend it if you're a fan of haunted house stories, and I'm giving The Shunned House a B. Then there's The Silver Key, and I didn't get much out of it, to be honest. It just felt like Lovecraft making a story out of writer's block, which does not make for a particularly interesting tale. It's a short story about Randolph Carter who finds himself stuck in a spell of writer's block and attempts to rekindle his muse, with hilarious results. The prose? It feels authentic, I'll give the story that. I too know how it feels to have your passions die on you. And knowing what I know about Lovecraft's early life, there was certainly an element of autobiography to it. I also really feel Carter's decision to just leave this plane of existence behind at the end of the story. I too would do that if given the chance. And the device of the titular key was simple, but it was also very effective. I liked it. The cons? I'm gonna have to get that meme I made of H.P. Lovecraft and Ian Fleming back out, because there are more awful racist phonetic accents in this story. It's not particularly scary, there aren't really any crazy concepts. As far as Lovecraft goes, it's pretty milquetoast. And like so many short stories, it doesn't grab the reader very well. It's fine for what it is, but it didn't really do anything for me. I'm not even sure who I would recommend it to other than Randolph Carter fans, I guess, and I'm giving The Silver Key a C. At last we come to the Dunwich Horror, one of Lovecraft's more famous tales, and it was really good. This definitely deserves a modern day adaptation. It's a story about the Whateleys, a family of backwater inbred hicks living in the middle of nowhere, New England, and their very strange newest younger member, Wilbur. The prose? It's kind of spoiled by virtue of being in a book where you can see how much of the story you have left, but I really loved the pacing of this one. Just when you think things are winding down, suddenly the plot ramps back up again. It's great. I also really loved how subtle a lot of the horror is in this one, as it builds up to a massive climax. The disappearing cattle, the strange renovations to the Whately house, how quickly Wilbur grows into an adult, they're all weird little pieces of the puzzle that finally clicks together at the end. But even before then, the Whateleys are a bunch of horrific individuals in their own right that feel frighteningly realistic at times. And I really liked the group of scientists who grow into the heroes of the story by the end. They were fun. The cons? This is another story struck down by Lovecraft's intentional vagueness. There are some great moments here that are rendered less effective than they should have been by his refusal to describe what the protagonists are fighting, though Wilbur was a nice exception in that regard. Lavinia Whately's role in the story is pretty much glossed over despite her being an integral part of it. She just walks right out of the tale after a certain point, and it's a shame that her side of things didn't get more attention, which is part of why I think a modern adaptation would be interesting. And there's nothing really to anchor the story around like a central protagonist or a narrator character like a lot of Lovecraft's other stories. It doesn't really need one, I suppose, but it did feel a little lacking as a result. But maybe that's just me. Nitpicks aside, this was a classic of 20th century horror, and I'd say it's definitely worth a read if you're a fan of the genre, warts and all. And I'm giving the Dunwich Horror an A. Next, there's The Whisperer in the Darkness, and it was actually pretty scary. This is another story that probably deserves its own modern adaptation. It's a story about a professor at the Miskatonic University, skeptical of the supernatural, who finds himself in contact with a farmer living on a remote property in Vermont, and the strange goings-on around his house. The prose? The distance between Wilmarth, the professor, and Akeley, the farmer, creates a real sense of dread. It really puts you in Wilmarth's shoes, both wanting to read Akeley's next letter, while also dreading what he has to say, especially when his tone does a complete 180 toward the end of the story. Like with The Colour Out of Space, this story does a great job of building up the horror elements by blending them with science fiction. It's a gradual shift, but it's really effective, especially once the true nature of the threat becomes apparent. And I've given Lovecraft a lot of crap over these reviews for refusing to elaborate on the most horrific aspects of his stories a lot of the time, but here it actually works really well, leaving the worst of the situation up to the imagination, but keeping things just vague enough to make Wilmarth think it was just an odd experience. The cons? Lovecraft really has only one voice when writing, when he isn't putting on some racist phonetic accent anyway, and it's obvious Wilmarth and Akeley both have the same author. It definitely takes a little while to get going. This is a real slow burn of a story, and effective as this story is, the way it's told does inherently rely on a ton of tell don't show, and it would have probably been more interesting to experience things from Akeley's point of view firsthand. It's just not exciting to read about all the crazy stuff that happens to him in a letter. Overall, I enjoyed it. If you're a Lovecraft fan, this definitely won't be anything you haven't read already, but it's still an effective bit of cosmic horror, and I'd recommend it if you're new to the genre. And I'm giving The Whisperer in the Darkness a B. Next, there's The Strange High House in the Mist, and it was meh. It had an interesting dreamlike quality to it, but the problem with dreams is that they are often fragmentary and worthless on their own. It's a short story about a family who moves to Kingsport, Massachusetts, and the patriarch who becomes obsessed with a strange, apparently inaccessible house on a cliff. The prose? The dreamlike quality I mentioned is probably the story's strongest point. There is something haunting about lights coming from a house on a dark hill in the distance. The protagonist's need to climb up the cliff to see what's inside the house was pretty relatable. As an audience member, it's easy to tell them off for how stupid they're being, like in a lot of horror media, but I can't honestly say I wouldn't do the same thing if I were in that situation. And the stuff waiting for the protagonist in the titular house was pretty crazy, though definitely not one of Lovecraft's better payoffs. The cons? There really is just nothing to this story aside from the imagery of the house on the hill. It felt pretty rough too, like Lovecraft just wrote it and forgot about it. And like I mentioned before, the payoff at the end of the story just wasn't worth the effort of reading through it. This one was mid. I completely understand why Weird Tales rejected it initially. I'm not really sure why some people like it so much. In my opinion, you can give it an easy skip. And I'm giving The Strange High House in the Mist a D. Sorry. After that is The Dreams in the Witch House, and it was okay. I'm going to be honest though, this one has never really been that interesting to me. It's about a student named Gilman who rents the attic of the titular witch house, and absolutely nothing bad happens, and he spends the rest of his university semester getting good night's sleep, and I'm obviously lying, things go crazy. The pros? Lovecraft gets clowned on a bit for his use of geometry and architecture as an element of horror, but the idea of an attic that is subtly the wrong size for the building it's meant to inhabit is really creepy, and the story only gets crazier from there. I really enjoyed the horror side of things in this one. It was also really nice to have a Lovecraft story featuring a couple of characters that are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and aren't portrayed as horribly racist stereotypes. The Polish tenants of the house may not be progressive by today's standards, but they're a breath of fresh air for this author. And there were a couple of darkly comedic moments in this story that I really appreciated. Maybe Lovecraft was wasted as a horror writer. The cons? So many of the ideas in this story are ones Lovecraft has used before, and in most cases he's used them better. All in all, it just felt a little repetitive, especially given I'm reading all these tales in one big collection. As a result, I found this story kind of difficult to get into. The hook was there, but I just need more than yet another cursed house in New England at this point. And Gilman just wasn't a very interesting protagonist. He's like all of Lovecraft's heroes. They all have the same voice, they all feel like the same person, they all feel like him. I'm just a bit over it. This story isn't bad, but at this point I'm a bit Lovecrafted out. There's definitely a lot to love about it, and I'd recommend it if you haven't given it a read already, but it didn't do much for me, and I'm giving The Dreams in the Witch House a B. Next there's From Beyond, and hey, it's better than the movie, but that's not really saying much. It's a short story about a scientist who builds a machine capable of emitting a wave that allows humans to perceive alternate planes of existence through stimulation of the pineal gland, and the extra-dimensional entities that can perceive humanity back. The pros? The idea of the machine itself is super cool and super creepy. The thought that you could be surrounded by super dangerous alien predators at all times, just separated by a layer of reality, is terrifying. Tillinghast might not be much of a character, but he's a sufficiently creepy mad scientist, and what an absolute banger of a name he has. And it was nice to have a Lovecraft protagonist come out on top for a change, and all it took him was one bullet. The cons? The writing in this one is pretty rough. It's definitely not one of Lovecraft's best on a technical level. The protagonist is even less of a character than Lovecraft's usual heroes. He doesn't even get a name, and the story just doesn't do its central idea justice. There's no character, there's no real build-up. The concept is great, but that's all it really is here. It could have been so much more. There's an idea for a great horror story here, and it does shine through in bits and pieces, but it's just not there in execution, which is a real shame. That said, I would still take it over its skeezy film adaptation, although there's not much to recommend given how short and empty it is. I wish I could say it was better, but it just isn't, and I'm giving From Beyond a C. Now we're up to the only collaborative work in the collection, Through the Gates of the Silver Key by H.P. Lovecraft and E. Hoffman Price, and wow, you can really tell someone else wrote part of this story. That said, it did give me a new appreciation for the Silver Key. It's a short story about Randolph Carter, the places he went after vanishing through the titular gates of the titular key, and the reading of his last will and testament now that everyone back on Earth has decided that he's dead. The prose? I don't know how much of this story is Price's and how much is Lovecraft's, but it was such a breath of fresh air to have even a slightly different authorial voice narrating this one. I love the concepts here, how Carter gets unstuck in time as much as he gets unstuck in space, looking forward and backward hundreds and thousands of years across hundreds and thousands of light years. It was great to actually get a look behind the curtain at some of the crazier things that can happen to a person in the mythos. And the other characters present at the meeting to decide Carter's estate added a little levity to what was otherwise an absolutely bonkers story. They were a lot of fun. The cons? Is it really brownface if you're no longer human when impersonating an Indian person? I don't have the answer, but it still rubbed me the wrong way. I guess that's why his portrayal was surprisingly non-racist, because underneath that turban he was secretly a good white lad all along. What a roller coaster that character was. Anyway, I didn't like it. Speaking of which, the ending twist becomes pretty obvious early on if you're familiar with these sorts of stories. Maybe it was a surprise back when it was written, but these days it's been done to death. And great as it was to get a glimpse behind the curtain, the story itself felt a little aimless overall. It definitely could have benefited from a bit of direction in Carter's quest across the cosmos. This was a great story. I really enjoyed it. It was a real breath of fresh air to get a new set of eyes on the mythos and all its possibilities. And if you enjoy the stories revolving around Randolph Carter, this is a definite must-read, and I'm giving Through the Gates of the Silver Key an A. Then there's At the Mountains of Madness, and wow does modern sci-fi horror owe a lot to this story. Understandable, really. It was pretty great. It's a novella about a scientific expedition into the unknown wastes of Antarctica that happens upon a mysterious mountain range, and that's when things get really weird. The prose? I really loved the build-up in this story. The science might be outdated in a couple of ways, but the plot's focus on it early on made things feel natural and mundane, so that when the titular mountains did show up and everything went mad, it provided a great contrast. It was really well done. Speaking of which, the horror elements of this story were fantastic. The mountains were great, the ruins hidden beneath them were great, the Shoggoths still wandering their empty halls were great, the terrible fate that befell the expedition was great. It was just perfect. And it's just a great setting for a story. It's very easy to understand why it was so influential. Antarctica is a scary place, and the novel makes the absolute best of it before the crazy stuff even begins. Plus, it's just nice to be out of New England. The cons? As good as the horror elements are, the narrator and his one companion are late to pretty much every party involving the other human members of the expedition, and that lack of character in the second half really grates. Maybe I'm just used to more recent interpretations of this kind of tale, building people up and picking them off one by one, but here the absence of that made the story feel a little lacking in my opinion. Speaking of which, all of the characters still feel like the same person. Only the narrator feels distinct in any way, and even then it's still just Lovecraft's normal style of first-person prose. And after a while I kind of got sick of how often the narrator kept going, "Oh, I'm almost at the most harrowing part of my tale, but I dare not speak of it for it is far too harrowing, and yet I must record it here." We get it, just get on with it. Aside from the first con, I struggled to find things I didn't like about this story. It was really good. You can see its legacy reaching like a shadow of a mountain over horror media ever since its publication. So if you're curious to learn where stories like Alien, John Carpenter's The Thing, its own literary progenitor Who Goes There, and Prometheus come from, I'd definitely give it a recommend. I'd definitely give it a read anyway because it's just a great story. If you only read one Lovecraft tale, make it this one. And I'm giving At the Mountains of Madness an S. At long last we come to The Shadow over Innsmouth, and it was another great read. It's pretty crazy how an author writing this today would probably frame the story completely differently, without actually having to change much about it. It's a short story about a young man who, while doing a tour of his family history through New England, finds himself in the strange town of Innsmouth, a place populated with odd individuals who tend to disappear after a while, and his decision, as a result of his stay, to call in the government to destroy the place. The pros. It's a great setup knowing right from the start that Innsmouth has been raided by the US government. It really pulls you in, making you wonder what exactly the guy went through to call in that kind of response. On that note, this story features what is probably Lovecraft's best action scene with the protagonist's escape from Innsmouth and its strange inhabitants. It really gets across the guy's terror at being hunted and just barely escaping by the skin of his teeth, and Innsmouth's whole backstory surrounding the Marsh family and the esoteric order of Dagon was really creepy, even if it is kind of xenophobic in a couple of ways. The cons? Well, sir, I really could not stand Zadok Allen, the drunken lout who relays most of Innsmouth's sordid backstory to the narrator. His phonetic speech pattern was insufferable, and his dialogue overall just felt unnatural. It takes a long time for things in this story to kick off. You have to survive Zadok's whole tale before the chase scene. The pacing overall is still very slow. And for how great the escape scene is, it ends very abruptly and feels a bit unfinished. This is another story I struggled to find things I didn't enjoy. Aside from Zadok, who can go to hell, it was really good. This is a horror classic. If you're a fan of the genre, you owe it to yourself to read it because it is just so good. And I'm giving The Shadow over Innsmouth an S. After that we come to The Shadow Out of Time, and what can I say? It's another winner. Whenever you come across a Lovecraft story with Shadow or Out in the title, you know you're in for a good time. It's a novella about a man who one day goes into a fugue state and spends several years existing as an entirely different person, before suddenly coming back to his senses, and the journey he takes to figure out just what exactly happened to him. The pros? I'm a sucker for stories set across vast expanses of time, and this has got to be in the running for the largest I've ever encountered. I loved that aspect of the story, especially how you get to see the ancient world in its prime, in the present day setting of the story, and a little into the future too. The idea that something inhuman could just take over your body one day and go on living your life for years afterward with no way for you to stop it is absolutely horrifying, but the concept is dealt with in a really subtle and creepy way. The horror elements of this story were just fantastic, and it was great to have a cosmic horror story set in Australia, at least in part. The tale makes great use of the landscape, and it was just nice to see one's own country represented, even if Lovecraft's thoughts on Indigenous Australians were probably pretty bad. The cons? Great as I found this story to be, it is written in a very old-fashioned way, which means a lot of information dumps without much focus on character, and I'm a little over the style at this point. The story is practically all build-up. It feels like it's driving towards some big horrific moment, as in At the Mountains of Madness, but it never comes. The climax is still very effective, but I was kind of left wanting, honestly, and this novella suffers from Lovecraft's old aversion to showing off the big monster at the end. There are a bunch of things that are probably best left to the imagination of the audience, but I still would have liked some expansion on one or two of the story's concepts, like the enemies of the Yithians. I really love this story. A lot of the horror concepts here are things I really connect with, and I also thought it was cool that it features a returning human character from At the Mountains of Madness, after a whole collection of only recurring supernatural threats. It might not be as flashy as something like Mountains, but I still loved it, and I'd easily give it a recommend. This is probably my favourite from the collection, and I'm giving The Shadow Out of Time an easy S. In an unfortunate slump, next there's The Haunter in the Dark, and it was still good, but it wasn't as good as the last few stories. Fun fact, this is actually one of his last. It's a short story about a writer who becomes obsessed with an old abandoned church, and in his folly decides to investigate the building, with horrific results. The pros? The church is a great setting. Abandoned churches are creepy enough places as is, but turning it into a familiar shell containing some sort of evil cosmic artifact was just the icing on the cake. It was really effective. The monster is pretty creepy too. Something that can only get you when you're in complete darkness speaks to a primal fear, and the end of the story where the city is suffering blackouts was super intense. And I liked Robert Blake as a protagonist, although that's probably more because I've read Providence by Alan Moore than because he's more interesting than any of Lovecraft's usual leading men. The cons? This story is a sequel to another tale written by Robert Bloch, and while it works fine enough on its own, I feel like there's a little context lost by not including it here for the sake of the reader. The elements of this story come together really well, but some of them are definitely ones that Lovecraft has used before. The monster only being able to get you in certain lighting conditions is very reminiscent of From Beyond, but whatever, it's a nitpick. And I just didn't find it as engaging as the longer stories collected at the end of this omnibus. But hey, me not liking short stories? What else is new? That said, I still liked it. It might use a few ideas from Lovecraft's earlier works, but I think it uses them better better overall. I'd give it a recommend if you've got 20 minutes to spare and are in the mood for some quick old-fashioned horror. It's something to read by candlelight if you ever find yourself stuck in a blackout, and I'm giving The Haunter in the Dark a B. After that there's The Thing on the Doorstep, and you know, reading through these stories, you really get the sense that Lovecraft didn't have many good relationships with women. The story was okay though. It's a short story about a young man whose best friend marries a strange woman. The pros? This is one of the few Lovecraft stories to have somewhat of a happy ending, and it was actually pretty refreshing to have one of his shorts end with the villain defeated and the day saved, though it's certainly not all sunshine and roses. The villain of this story is terrifying, made much worse by the fact that they are undeniably human rather than a supernatural threat, and just as it was refreshing to have a Lovecraft story with a happy ending, it was also refreshing to have a woman in a leading role. The cons? That said, the role is technically the villain. Lovecraft's never going to be given any posthumous awards for inclusivity. This one felt a bit repetitive. A lot of the horror concepts here are ones Lovecraft has used before, and I would say has used better. And I don't buy the friendship between the narrator and Ed. I don't buy a 16-year-old being friends with an 8-year-old, no matter how precocious the kid is. It's just a very strange setup for their friendship that acts as a rock in your shoe for the whole story. It might be a nitpick, but I was never able to get over it. It's a decent story. The complaints I have are mostly nitpicks. If you enjoyed Christine by Stephen King, this tale is kind of a spiritual predecessor to that one, so you might find something to like about it. And I'd still give it a recommend if you're a fan of horror in general, but it's definitely not Lovecraft's best, and I'm giving The Thing on the Doorstep a B. After that comes the longest tale in this collection, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and it was good, but it definitely has some problems. Though I'll give it this, it's much more together than a lot of other posthumous releases I've read. It's a book about the titular Charles Dexter Ward who suddenly becomes obsessed with his distant ancestor Joseph Curwen, and the strange series of events that follows. The pros? Much like with The Thing on the Doorstep, it was nice to have a Lovecraft story that has a relatively happy outcome for its protagonists, after so many endings where the leads end up dead or mad. Also, like with The Thing on the Doorstep, the horror elements are made much more visceral by virtue of the fact the main threat is human, rather than anything otherworldly. And it was super cool to have a cosmic horror that is nominally good for a change. That was a really nice change of pace. The cons? This is a bit of a convoluted complaint, but even though this book was written first, it was published after a bunch of Lovecraft's other works that feature similar themes and elements, like The Shadow Out of Time and The Thing on the Doorstep, and they are used much better in those stories than they are here. In this case, they feel just a little half-baked. This book is written in the same old-fashioned style as all of Lovecraft's works, and it is a struggle to get through a novel-length example of that kind of writing, especially when it mostly focused on the history of a single family in New England, rather than an Antarctic expedition that happens to run into an ancient alien city. And once again, I can't get past the racism. If I had $1 for every H.P. Lovecraft story I've read featuring a cat with a racial slur for a name, I'd have $2, which isn't a lot, but it's still weird that it happened twice. It's a decent read, but like I said, I feel like Lovecraft surpassed this iteration of the story in several of his later works that were published first, and the length is just a bit too much for me. I know, the guy who hates short stories doesn't like the only novel in the collection, but that's just the way things go sometimes. That said, it's still good, and if you're a fan of Lovecraft or his style of horror, I'd recommend it, and I'm giving The Case of Charles Dexter Ward a B. Now we come to the final story in the collection, though not the final entry, The Dream Quest of the Unknown Kadath, and I have no idea what to make of this one. This story was just utter madness. I don't know if I liked it, I don't know if I hated it, I really don't know what to feel about it. It's a novella about Randolph Carter and his quest for the titular Kadath after leaving the waking world behind for the madness of dreams. The pros? This story is a bit like The Avengers in that it brings together a bunch of characters from a bunch of Lovecraft's works like Robert Pickman and the Night-Gaunts and the town of Ulthar, and it was really cool to see them thrown together like that. I really enjoyed it. I also really enjoyed the return of fantasy. It's been ages since Lovecraft jumped full on into the genre, and it was a nice change of pace from the onslaught of New England set terror tales throughout the collection. And this story features an extremely rare Lovecraftian battle sequence, and it was really good. I wish he had written more, honestly, because that was a ton of fun. The cons? I've come to realise at the very end of this collection that I just didn't much like Randolph Carter as a character, at least not when Lovecraft was writing him. Even when he's lost in dreamland, he's a very boring self-insert kind of protagonist, and my feelings were no different here. Nice as it was for Lovecraft to jump into fantasy, I could not stand some of his fantasy names like Zoogs and Womps and Gugs. It felt like a parody of this kind of story. I just could not take them seriously, and I just did not care about the titular dream quest. I enjoyed some of the steps, like Carter's stop in Ulthar and the battle toward the end, but as a whole I found it to be a real slog. I really need more character and better stakes to put up with these kinds of long fantasy quests anymore. It's not bad, but it's very rough, which makes sense given it was published posthumously. Overall, it just really wasn't for me. I wish we could have ended things on a higher note, but it is what it is. If you're a fan of Lovecraft's other Randolph Carter stories, you'll probably enjoy it, but if you're not an avid reader of early 20th century pulp fantasy, you probably won't have a good time. The genre has progressed so much since this was written, and I'm giving the dream quest of the unknown Kadath a C. Sorry. And finally, there's To a Dreamer, a short poem and the final entry in this collection of weird tales, and it was a very sweet note to end on. It bookends the whole thing really well. It's a poem about a heart-to-heart regarding the horrors of the cosmos from one dreamer to another. The prose? It's a very haunting bit of poetry, especially after reading through the entire collection. It feels like Lovecraft speaking directly to the reader, who has also gone on this horrific journey with him through his writings. It was very effective in that way. The horror is very subtle here. It's mostly through implications, but it works. And there were a couple of rhymes in there that I thought were really good. The cons? That said, the rhyming scheme is very basic. There's not much to it. There are a couple of dumb made-up fantasy words here that really kill the mood. I really can't take them seriously. And there's just not much to it. You can read it in 30 seconds, but that's just a nitpick. It's short, it's sweet, I don't really have much to say about it, but I can't really think of a better bit of Lovecraft's writings to end things on. And if you're reading it in this collection, you might as well give it a look. You've made it this far, and I'm giving To a Dreamer a B. And so, with all that out of the way, I can finally review the whole collection. So without further ado, hey everyone, I just read the Necronomicon, the best weird tales of H.P. Lovecraft, and it was a real mixed bag. It's a collection of short stories, novellas, poems, and a single short novel about the horrors of the cosmos and their interactions with lowly humans who unfortunately come to their attentions. The prose? This guy could come up with some creepy concepts. The horror elements were inventive, effective, and sometimes even scary. They may have been beaten into the dirt by other writers in the 100 years since Lovecraft's time, but they're still really good in their original form here. When he's at his best, Lovecraft has a great command of the English language in his prose. It might be a bit verbose and outdated by today's standards, but I still found most of his stories to be pretty readable, and I love how interconnected all these stories are. The world building and mythology built across Lovecraft's bibliography is really cool, especially with how collaborative it was with other writers. The cons? Lovecraft was great with concepts, but he was not good at character, either in terms of characterization or in dialogue. All his protagonists feel like a variation on the same person, himself, and all the written dialogue just feels painfully unnatural. It was awful. He tended to reuse a lot of plot points and twists, and while it wasn't a huge problem, it was definitely noticeable reading them all in quick succession in a collection like this. And I've harped on it a lot, but it bears repeating. Lovecraft had some awfully xenophobic views that bled right through his writings, and it really sours his legacy reading these stories in the present day. Going back to read his work, it's easy to see why Lovecraft has been such an influential writer. Horror media of the last century owes a huge amount to him and his stories. There's no denying that he was a terrible person in some ways. His views were extreme even for the time, but he's long dead now. His writing only really found its audience after his passing, and he opened the door for the myriad other creators who followed in his footsteps, so you kind of have to take the good with the bad. That said, for all his faults, a lot of his writing is still pretty great, and aside from the racism, still holds up today, and I'd easily give it a recommend if you're a fan of horror stories and haven't already checked him out. And I'm giving the works of H.P. Lovecraft an A. And that's it, the best weird tales of H.P. Lovecraft reviewed, and here they are all ranked. It was fun going back through this collection and rediscovering these stories, despite the faults of their author. It still did nothing to change my mind about short stories in general though. Anyway, happy Halloween everyone. I hope you enjoyed this overly long, rambling special video. If you did and want to see more, please like, subscribe and share the video around. I'd really appreciate it. I'm always on the lookout for reading requests, so if there's something you'd like me to check out, post it down in the comments below. I promise I'll get to it eventually. If you're a fan of unnecessarily long gaming critiques, I have a second channel, MonotomReads, that might scratch that itch. You can find the link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Bye everyone!